Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and today we're focusing on mechanisms of dispute resolution. Informal mechanisms of resolving disputes can often be as important as formal ones, so are there ways in which we can strengthen them? Hello, my name is Alan Renwick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Today, we're focusing on a fascinating new piece of research just published by one of my colleagues. Alexandra Hartman is Associate Professor in Political Science and Public Policy here at UCL, and her research focuses on the political economy of institutions in fragile states. She looks not just at formal political institutions, such as courts or legislatures, but also at what we political scientists like to call informal institutions, the unwritten structures of norms and established practices that people follow in their interactions with each other. Such informal institutions can be crucial in shaping how societies operate. And Alex examines whether policymakers can intervene to nudge them in directions that might lead to better outcomes. In particular, her new study, just published in the Journal of Politics and co-authored with Robert Blair from Brown University and Christopher Blattman from the University of Chicago, looks at ways of resolving land disputes in Liberia. It's fair to say that the results are mixed, and they help us think both about the kinds of policy mechanisms that might be effective, both in Liberia and elsewhere, and about how we can measure that effectiveness so that we can seek to identify the best policies for the future. Well, I'm delighted to say that Alex joins me now. Alex, welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics. And can you maybe start by giving us a bit of background? Can you describe the situation in Liberia that the programs that you examine in this research sought to address?
Sure. Hi, Alan. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you today. It's a real pleasure. So you asked me about the situation in Liberia that the programs we evaluated in this research sought to address. And so I think it's important for myself to kind of take a moment to travel back in time because this research started now over a decade ago. So, Liberia has, like everywhere in the world, undergone a lot of changes since that time. But when I first started working in Liberia, when I was a graduate student, it was a country that had begun the process of emerging from a period of real instability. And it was a country where the United Nations still had a strong presence and was working to assist the government and people to rebuild and to make stability more likely in the future. So this was a post-conflict situation where people were working to try to get to that period of stability, but it wasn't quite there yet.
And you were focusing particularly on land disputes and the resolution of land disputes. Why was that such a big issue?
Well, that's a great question. Land is a really important part of most economies, and I think it's more or less obvious depending on the perspective that we have. So even in our very quote unquote developed or industrialized societies, property is a critical input and it shapes power dynamics. It shapes who has access to resources and who doesn't. And sometimes we shift the focus away to other kinds of political economic power, like capital, for example, or labor. But real property has played a fundamental role in the development of states. And particularly in societies that are still concentrated in the agrarian sector, where many people are farmers and where that's an important part of economic activity, land is a really crucial input to many people's livelihoods and daily lives, in addition to serving the purpose that it does for all of us, which is a place to live. Our houses are real property assets too. So in this paper and most of my work, I'm actually looking at land rights and land disputes, but also disputes and rights over housing and other kinds of real property. So given the importance that these real assets play in people's daily lives, they are also very important when they're contested, which is to say that if you need this kind of an asset or access to this kind of asset, a house or a field, if you don't have access or if your access is involved or tied up in a fight, then it can cause a lot of problems in your life and in the lives of your neighbors and your community members, and even in the stability of your country.
And if I understand correctly, disputes over land ownership were very widespread in Liberia, and there was a lot of kind of uncertainty as to how exactly to resolve these. So lots of records had been lost during the Civil War period. So this was a big issue, and so if we're thinking from a UK perspective, we might think, okay, the courts would be involved in that case, and that there would be authorities that would make these decisions. But in the particular circumstances of Liberia at the time, that just wasn't an option. It wasn't an option for many people, at least. So it was important for there to be other mechanisms by which these disputes could be resolved. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So you're making this really important link that I try to make in my work between the importance of property rights and then the institutions that govern those rights. And just as you explained, here in the UK, where I currently am, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, for example, because he or she plays the music too loud, or, for example, your neighbor is stealing the apples from the apple tree that's growing in your garden. I know on my block, for example, there's a neighbor of mine that has a pear tree, which is laden with fruit, Alan. This person has a green thumb. And myself and my children walk by this tree and, we're jealous. We want a pear too, but we refrain from doing that because if we did that at scale, right, if we really went over that wall and gathered up those pears, we would be stealing the fruit. And we might expect some kind of consequence to that action, in part because of the formal justice system that you described here in the UK. In many post-conflict states, and this is not the same, this is not special to Liberia, this is really found all over the world, formal institutions suffer during conflict. And they can suffer in lots of different kinds of ways, but one consequence is that they often become inaccessible or dysfunctional for certain parts of the population. So there are different ways that can play out. In the specific case of Liberia, formal institutions like courts and the justice system really collapsed and were inaccessible to most people in the post-conflict period. So you can imagine when we started working on this project that not only property rights disputes, but all kinds of disputes had to be resolved not through formal institutions, but through other systems on the ground.
And so we're talking here about informal institutions. That's the phrase I used at the top of the podcast, at least. What do we actually mean by that? It's a fairly weird bit of jargon.
Yeah, I think this is something that becomes weird when we're so used to thinking about the right way or the only way to do something. So going back to the example of that pear tree, initially my neighbor, if he caught me stealing his pears, might sort of stop me, might lie in wait behind the pear tree, see if I was taking those pears, and then confront me, right, in an effort to resolve the issue, right? Because I seem to think that I have a right to those pears. He doesn't agree with that, right? He sees those pears as his own. The tree is on his property. And if that interaction didn't go well, according to me or according to him, we would take a set of next steps, right, in order to try to resolve this issue where I'm, according to him, taking his pears. Maybe I, don't understand the wall to have the same significance that he understands. Maybe I think that his garden is actually a communal garden, right, where we all have rights to that fruit. In London, when I first moved here, I was very surprised to see a number of communal gardens, right, which a small group of people living around a shared square, for example, have access to a piece of property. So maybe that's what I understand the wall to mean. That's not uncommon for reasonable people to disagree. The thing about the UK is that process of trying to resolve the dispute would probably take a pretty typical path, right? If we couldn't work it out ourselves, then we would probably pretty quickly move to involving lawyers, involving the justice system. And so that's very clear to both of us. We agree on what that path would look like. In other contexts, if the formal institutions are not there, then people use other options. And these other options are what informal institutions are. So we have to imagine that first moment when the neighbor and myself, we try to work it out. We try to come to an agreement about who gets the pears. That's an informal institution, right? That's person-to-person dispute resolution. And if that didn't work out, then maybe in our neighborhood, right, there's a neighborhood association, or there's, our block has a group of people who get together every couple months to work out issues. And we would go there to try to resolve the issue. And that is also an informal institution. when people are using these resources to resolve their disputes, as long as it's not part of a written administrative or legal protocol, we can understand that to be informal. And you're right, it can be a little bit of a tricky concept because it's context specific. So what informal institutions apply really depends on who you are and where you are at any given time. And it encompasses a wide range of things. So, the fact that you and I, as my neighbor and the person who's taking the pairs, would probably in the first instance try to talk it out between us. Mm-hmm. That's an informal institution, but it's more of a norm, right? This idea that if you have a problem with someone, you try to work it out between you first. And so we can understand that to be an informal institution, but I think that sometimes at first glance, people don't understand that to be an institution. They just sort of understand it maybe to be a tendency that people have to work something out.
So I guess an institution here is just a kind of set of rules, set of practices and norms and things, or maybe at the weak end of such rules, but actually they can be really important for determining what happens. So shall we move on to away from the pairs and onto the Liberian case? So the intervention that you studied in this piece of work sought to essentially strengthen existing informal institutions for dispute resolution. Can you just talk us through a little bit what was involved in that program?
Yeah, that's right. So in the Liberian case, there had been a large amount of displacement during the conflict, and people were coming back slowly over time. And there were a lot of disputes over property rights. And as I mentioned before, those are very critical rights, and property is a critical input to economic development and to stability. And so these disputes were making it difficult for people to feel secure, to want to return after the conflict, to have amicable relationships within their communities. And because formal institutions had been damaged, there were very few courts that were operational, if any. There were very few lawyers. There was a certain amount of distrust of formal institutions, given things that had unfolded during the conflict. Because of this context, the United Nations had this idea that it would be good to try to firm up informal institutions, so to give a little bit more structure and some more skills to people who would be trying to resolve competing claims themselves. And that was the goal of the program. It was to try, in the absence of formal institutions, to support people, both leaders and community members, to work together to resolve these kinds of disputes, not only property disputes, although that ended up being a big focus of the program, but all kinds of small disputes that people have.
So this was basically a kind of training program, is that right?
Yeah, so the way the program worked was villages that were included and were eligible to participate received pretty extensive training. So there are a lot of different kinds of training programs that unfold, in Liberia and all over the world, and some of them tend to be quite light touch. This, I think, was on the more intensive side. So over the course of a couple of months, trainers who had been themselves trained by a master trainer in the techniques of dispute resolution lived in the community, and they trained the community members and community leaders in techniques of dispute resolution. And then they also mentored and supported leaders to kind of try out these techniques and resolve disputes. And that once that was over, they moved on to the next community.
And really crucial for your research into this is that some communities got this treatment, to use the kind of language that we often use, drawing from the medical world. So some communities got this training program, and other communities didn't get the training program. And the communities were randomly allocated, is that right, as to whether they got the training or not? And that then allows you to measure the effects of the training program more accurately than would otherwise be the case.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the challenges with evaluating public policies like this one is that there are a lot of things that can lead to the change in how people are resolving disputes and their experience with making claims over property. It could be that the government was trying to firm up the formal justice system at the same time. It could be that the natural process of increasing and consolidating stability after the conflict led to changes in trust and changed the way people interacted. Lots of things could be happening that could affect the intended outcome of the program. So the research design that we use in this case is called a randomized controlled trial. And what we do is we look at a set of communities that could benefit from this training and we look at the resources that the United Nations has to allocate the program. And so in the end, the United Nations doesn't have enough resources to give this training program to all the communities that could potentially benefit. So what we do is we randomly allocate the program to some eligible communities. Other communities maybe could benefit if there was increased funding in the future. And then because of random assignment, we can set up what I call a counterfactual analysis. So we have a case study of communities that have received the training, and we can look at what goes on in those communities when it comes to dispute resolution. And then we have a counterfactual, which is a set of communities that have not received the training. And because of random assignment, those two cases look very similar on all dimensions except the presence of the training program. So we attempt to causally identify the impact of the training program through that research design.
And how often is it that you have a situation where a body such as the United Nations is willing to have a bunch of researchers come along and basically decide a really important part of the structure of their program in terms of who's getting it and who isn't getting it?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So I think it's increasingly very likely, in fact. And in fact, the United Kingdom, the UK government has been one of the major sources of funding for this kind of research in the past decade. They're really into this research design and supporting both implementing partners and policymakers in a variety of contexts to partner with researchers in order to set up studies like this. Sometimes it's referred to as sort of evidence-based policymaking, and it's pretty popular. There's a little bit of serendipity that goes into setting up large-scale research projects like this. So this was a massive research project. I think maybe it doesn't come through in the article, but this was a project that was started in 2009. Over 10 years later, the second or the third, actually, in a series of 3 papers that we wrote about this has come out. There were also a large set of policy briefs that were written up at the time, a lot of consultations and presentations. Much gold, much loot was put into this, both on the part of the United Nations and also on our part as researchers. And so it's a really big undertaking, and it doesn't always work out when researchers and policymakers and stakeholders want to do a study like this. But I think increasingly people who are making policy want to know, what the effect of that policy is and what it would look like if they didn't do that policy. And this kind of research design, where it is necessary for both the stakeholders and the researchers to come in and do some kind of random assignment, is interesting to policymakers.
Maybe there are some listeners who will say, yeah, okay, I can see the point that we're trying to establish what works here, what policy interventions work. But still, it kind of sounds like you're conducting experiments on the people of Liberia without necessarily their having any say in that process. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. So one of the things we must do, I think, in all of our research, not only research where different policies are tested through random assignment, is be really forthcoming and engage deeply with the participants in the research and the potential costs and benefits of their participation. So, in some sense, this falls most heavily, I think, on policymakers and people who are implementing the policies that researchers are studying. So, we as researchers didn't design this program. We, encouraged the policymaker, in this case, the United Nations, to randomly allocate the program, but they are the key decider in this context and have to, I think, communicate fairly and engage in an open dialogue with the population in order for people to consent and to see the benefit of doing the policy in this way. And I'm working on another study right now where I'm working with the Ivorian government on a similar effort to evaluate policies around their land laws. And, in this case, it's the Ivorian government's decision both to randomize certain elements of their policy and then also to communicate the fact that some people will be offered the opportunity to participate in something that not everyone has the opportunity to participate in right now, in order for the government to understand how that policy works. And if people want to participate, they can. And if they don't want to, they absolutely don't have to. And it's completely free and fair. I think one of the compelling framings of this problem is the fact that, unlike here in the United Kingdom, in many places, there is simply not enough either capacity or resources to provide a program or a policy to everyone at the same time. So there's naturally going to be some prioritization or ordering of who's going to get to experience a policy. And so what we as researchers can offer to policymakers is an opportunity to say, well, if you have a set of people who could benefit from this, but you know you can't provide this policy to everyone in the first instance, why don't we randomize it first and see what the impacts are? And you also might be able to learn who benefits differently or better, for example, or who maybe experiences an unintended consequence. And then you can more efficiently or effectively roll out the intervention in the next stage. Or you might learn that, in fact, it doesn't have the intended impact and it's better to actually switch over and do something else. So I think in situations where you have resources to provide something to everyone and there isn't a natural constraint, it is more difficult to justify the program or the programming decision to randomize, unless there's a huge amount of uncertainty about the policy's impact.
So let's now turn to talking about the impact of these policies. And you've said that this is a very long-standing project, and I think you've previously published a study that looked at the effects of this program after 1 year. And in this article that's published now, you're looking at the effects of the program after 3 years. Do you want firstly to describe what were the effects that you found and how you measured that as well, I guess, after 1 year, and then we can move on to the effects after 3 years.
Yeah, so the way that we measure the impacts of this policy is we do community level and household level surveys. So in both communities that participated in these training programs and communities that did not, but were eligible to do so, we go back after the program has finished and we ask people questions about their experience. And then we can compare the questions in the communities where the program took place to questionnaires that were completed with community members in places where it didn't happen. And that's how we identify any difference between those populations. And after 1 year, the program had quite a promising impact. I think we were a bit surprised because training programs are really loved by policymakers. So there's so much training that goes on all over the world, and sometimes with uncertain impact. And I think we were, pleasantly surprised to see a reduction in the amount of violence that people reported was associated with their disputes. And we also saw that there was an increased rate of dispute resolution after 1 year. And so we were really happy to see those effects. And we felt that, that was an encouraging sign that the program had done something that it had intended to do. Now, one of the challenges with work like this, I mentioned that it was really expensive and it required a lot of coordination and years of work. And, because of this, other programs are similarly resource intensive. And so they tend not to be followed up, or we tend not to go back and try to see what the medium term or long term impacts are of programs like this. But very fortunately, in this case, we had resources to go back 3 years, about 3 years after the program had finished, to see if the changes that we found after 1 year were sticky. Because I think oftentimes, we're happy to go in and achieve these changes, but if they fade away immediately, we're not really sure if it's worth the investment, right? Because a lot of money was put into trying to firm up these dispute resolution mechanisms. And so what we find after 3 years is that some of the effects stick around. So people do report less violence in the property rights disputes that they are still having, right? And we understand that there's going to be some rate of claims and counterclaims over property in any population, right? So maybe it's not that surprising that there are still quite a few disputes, but violence has gone down. However, the rate of dispute resolution has not continued to accelerate, right? So we still do see disputes. And the other thing that we see is that it may not play out in the same way for all members of the community. So I think this was one of the findings that was most important for me and has really shaped the trajectory of my future, at that time it was my future research, now it's my present research, which is that the training program was designed for everyone. It was kind of a one-size-fits-all training, but it was pretty clear that within communities, some people have more or less power, and that groups with less power in the community might experience the training differently and might have maybe a slightly negative experience. And so going forward, one of the research questions that I'm really interested in understanding is how do low-powered groups or excluded groups experience these kind of policies, and maybe how can we creatively adjust policies so that all groups can benefit.
So just before we go on to how this work kind of shapes your ongoing research agenda, shall we just sort of close the loop on the Liberia case in itself? And does your research now feed into, or has it fed into, adjustments on the ground in terms of how the government, the UN, relevant agencies are approaching these issues in Liberia?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has. In Liberia, there has been, I think, a lot of openness because of this research to maintaining a high degree of community participation in resolving land disputes. So there's been an openness to keeping community members and not only community leaders, but just regular people involved in dispute resolution and using, in particular, mediation as a means of resolving disputes and keeping disputes out of the formal court system, because research like this and other research, more qualitative research in Liberia, has shown that people really benefit and also sometimes prefer to resolve disputes amongst themselves as opposed to involving formal institutions. So yeah, this has, I think, been a very promising, opened up a promising avenue of policy development in Liberia.
And final question, alas, our time always goes too quickly. Tell us a bit more then about your current research and your ongoing research, and how the work that you've done in the past has kind of fed into that, and what the ongoing agenda for your work is.
Yeah, so at the moment, I have a bunch of different research questions that I'm approaching, but one of them that ties most directly to this work is how previously excluded or underpowered groups experience institutional change, and particularly changes around property rights, and how that shapes relationships within households, within communities, and within countries. So I focus particularly on women, but also other people who in the past have not had a strong voice in property rights. So one of my projects looks at access to natural resources, common natural resources, so forests, in particular in Liberia, but also just general common property. And we look at how increasing access to information about forests, not only for people who are the traditional or historical decision makers about forests and common natural resources, but also increasing access to information for everyone, so making the property rights governance more inclusive, how that shapes people's, social outcomes and relationships in the community. And so that research, I think, ties directly to my experience when I first started working in Liberia.
Well, we'll have to have you back on the podcast some future time so that you can talk about that research as well. This has been so interesting, Alex, and so kind of affirming of the possibility of doing research that has a positive impact in the world. It's really, really great. So thank you so much, Alex Hartman, for joining us on the podcast this week. And if you would like to read more about the research that we've been discussing, you'll find full details of Alex's article, co-authored with Robert Blair and Christopher Blackman, on the show notes for this episode. Next week, we're looking at the morality of political riots with our colleague, Dr. Avia Pasternak. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Renwick. Our podcast producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.